Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Metropolitan Republican Club's webinar series. My name is Krisha Lenzo, and on behalf of the MedCub board, we are so happy you are joining us tonight. As a reminder, we have a donation link in our live chat, and we hope you'll consider making a contribution to help support our club and content like this. We also have a new donation feature, Facebook Stars, so be sure to check that out. So tonight, we are very lucky to have the People's Pundit with us, Richard Baris. Richard is America's top pollster as the director of Big Data Poll and data journalism editor at the People's Pundit Daily. He's the author of the must-read book on American philosophy, Our Virtuous Republic, and he's the host of the popular show Inside the Numbers. Not to mention, he was the main person I turned to on election night to truly know what was going on when every single network seemed to be conflicted or giving somewhat of a wrong opinion. And we'll go into that tonight, but discussing all this and more, welcome Richard Baris.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Really appreciate it.
Sure thing. So let's just start off with your background. Polling is not, necessarily something that everyone can get involved with. It requires a tremendous amount of background with, mathematics, statistics. How did you get involved in this particular industry?
Yeah, statistics, that's a great start for anybody who wants to do it. That's what I fell in love with. And then I've always been in numbers, but I used it for financial in the beginning. So, and then after a while, I always as a lover of politics, and I've always been involved in politics, I eventually pivoted. I wanted something else to do. And I always knew people in the business and kind of came up around, people still around today, but in 2014, that's when we took things public. That's when we started the election projection model. And I was trying to basically prove what I had believed for a couple of years before, which is that these shifts that we see in polls in the media, they love a horse race, but public opinion doesn't change like that. In all of my years doing it prior, it really was more about challenges that the polling industry was facing in the modern era than it was about wildly shifting public opinion, that those are artifacts of the polls themselves. And so in 2014, we included that in the model, but we also did still include public polling. It was still variables that we put into the model. And the one and only change we made since then was diminish the weight that public polls have in the model because they're so bad and they're getting even worse. So we outperformed, which gave us recognition, not as much as I would have liked, right? That quickly, but it did give us recognition. We outperformed the competitors. And then in 2016, unless I'm mistaken, we were the only election projection model to get the Electoral College correct. And that was the polling that Big Data Poll was conducting. So we took all of the public polling off the table at that point, and we only relied on the data that was being collected by Big Data Poll. And that was the first year we went full online. We had experimented a lot like what Barack Obama had done in 2012, which is that you really don't need to poll randomly all this large, samples of the population if you can identify who is truly persuadable. And then we did that in 2014, and in 2016 we expanded that to a national instead of only state by state. And we did subgroups for each of the battleground states. And we did something very much different than what anybody else was doing. And, to this day, I would credit that for why we were successful and others were not.
And in terms of who is being polled, can you describe them to us? Because I personally have never been polled. I would love to be, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, so there are people I meet who say that say what you just said. And then there are others that I meet that say they're polled all the time and maybe they're in a battleground state. And that's actually not surprising to me because pollsters get their hands on these lists from the voter files. And there are regulations and you're supposed to scrub and update them every 10 days. But believe it or not, that doesn't happen as much as it should. So if you do find yourself on one of these lists, chances are you will be polled repeatedly. So basically that's a major problem with the industry today, though, who is actually being polled. And more we hear a lot about social desirability bias. It is true. In 2016, you could have gotten around that if you were polling the way we were polling. but it is more of a combo of response biases and social biases. The problem is we're trying to rely on randomization in a world that's changing, and it's not the same anymore where the entire population that represents the electorate all has a landline. So we can just pick up a list and call landlines and rely on the laws of randomization to help us. The minute that we begin to diversify how we collect data because we're trying to reach different people, we're betraying randomization. So that is something the polling industry hasn't figured out yet. And it's skewing more and more towards metro left-leaning groups. They want to participate at higher rates. And it's a bit of a saying I have all the time, but it's true. Different groups of people participate in these polls, depending on the data collection mode, at different rates. And females tend to want to participate a lot more than males. They tend to participate more in landlines. Younger men can be reached by cell phone, but maybe older men cannot. So you really have to learn who participates in these different modes, and that has to be part of your methodology. And sadly, they're not there yet. They're just not there.
It's so fascinating. And in terms of the general landscape of, those who are out there, we had Rasmussen, they were retweeting us. And you mentioned even before we got started, we were talking about the different polling, firms that are out there. Obviously, some are more reputable than others. You and, some might say Nate Silver on the left or right. I don't even know if it's left or right anymore. I mean, the fact that polling is even considered political now is somewhat strange. But can you just talk about the general landscape?
Yeah, that's what, before what I was trying to convey basically is that the private industry of polling is not what you see in the media and how people are, react to a pollster's results, for instance. Everyone has their respective corners. Pollsters are put into the left-right category. Yeah. The media basically has done this to us. In the media space, you would never recognize how it is privately. We used to, but many of us still do, talk to each other. I know most of my vendors are liberal. That doesn't matter. It has no bearing on a relationship. People like Nate Silver. All right. And I would just say this before I continue. Those modelers are never going to be any more accurate until the polls are more accurate, because they're not modelers. They're poll readers, glorified poll readers with good IT teams and web design teams who put up these really cool graphics to make you think they're smarter than you. There's not a whole lot that goes into it. If the polls are wrong, Nate Silver is going to be wrong, because Nate Silver is not a pollster. He's a poll reader. So that's one thing I would say. But I would argue that these actors like him have made it worse. They have polarized us more. So Rasmussen releases a result. It doesn't matter. They were more accurate than the media and university polling world in 2016. They're, either dismissed outright or worse, attacked by people on the left who don't want to believe those results, don't want to see it as more competitive. And sadly, the same happens on the right. I would argue that one side, however, the media and university polling world, probably deserves it a lot more. I mean, there's a conversation that we could have and should have had in 2016. They buried it, and it became about not what can we do better, but, well, I guess we weren't really that inaccurate in the first place. It was widely overblown. And in 2018, when we went into those midterms, you could see how bad the state level polling was going to be. And we had very different results in Senate races. And my concern was, going into 2020, it doesn't really matter if you got a little bit closer on the generic ballot. The presidential election is a state by state by state election. And if they didn't show that they fixed any of these problems going into these Senate races, how on earth were they going to accurately poll the presidential election? And that is sadly, that's exactly what happened. And we got, Biden plus 17s in Wisconsin by an allegedly reputable firm in media who polls for a major media outlet. And across the board, Pennsylvania, Biden 9-10 points, and all of these states turned out to be very close. And some of the states that were not, that the former president won, were being shown as competitive. And I got to tell you, when we were looking at our own results, I don't know how they came. Some of it, again, could be methodology, but I don't know how you miss Wisconsin by 17 points. I don't know how Ohio ever looks competitive to you. We never had Joe Biden any closer than 6 points in Ohio. He was down by 6. That was the closest he ever got to Donald Trump. Iowa, never close. Florida it always looks close, but the former president had a very clear edge there very early. So, I would say, like in life, the polling issue is complicated. Just like there's a problem in life, there's a problem with polling. There's no one good answer, but it's really twofold, and this is a good place to start. We have methodological problems, and I think, sadly, we have ethical problems. If you don't know the population, it's essentially trying to predict behavior. And if you don't understand a population, if you don't understand a certain group of people, and maybe you even look down on them, then how on earth could you predict their behavior?
Exactly.
It's that simple.
Well, turning to election night, which was something we certainly didn't predict. I was watching you on election night. You were on War Room. You were on various outlets talking about polling data, and as the results were coming in, it just seemed everything was in line with what you predicted. And then, we were watching. 2 a.m. hit. We were all convinced, President Trump was going to win. And then there was a dramatic reversal. Can you talk about that experience on election night and what was going through your mind? And especially with the Arizona call, with Fox News really making that call before anyone else. And everyone was really shocked about that.
Yeah, I maintain that Fox News, they owe the country, their viewers particularly, an apology for that call. I think, Arizona turned out to be very close, but there was no way they could have known with that share of the vote how it was going to come down. Their exit polling, their voter analysis, which they abandoned traditional exit polls for what they call voter analysis, and they do that with the AP, and it's through the AmeriSpeaks panel. It's a good effort to try to clean up the problem with exit polls. The problem is in 2018, it was badly inaccurate. In the 2020 primary for Democrats, it was badly inaccurate. And going into the election on election night, it was clearly inaccurate. So using voter analysis data to make judgment calls like that was inexplicable. And I, the cynic in me says that they wanted that call because, Trump, they needed Trump to have a must-win state, not win, right? So not go for him. And the pattern all night was very clear. We got a chunk of the absentee vote, mail-in vote, and we could see what the break was going to be, the margin was going to be. And the election day vote had to overtake that. In the states where we had, I would argue, a little bit more integrity and a lot less irregularities, the president's election day vote overcame it. Florida is a great example. It ran like a well-oiled machine. Yes, Joe Biden got, the lion's share, especially in the urban centers. We saw ridiculous margins. That happens. And I think because it was so messy, it sowed a lot more distrust than it should have. There are precincts that come in 90%, 95% for Democrats. That wasn't the problem. The problem was we were getting these ranges of estimated vote remaining because nobody knew what was outstanding. And that is not typical for an election. We know what is outstanding. We have a general idea what is outstanding. And when you call election officials and you ask them what is outstanding in your precincts or your counties, and they don't know, then I don't know how you conduct an election like that. That's very much third world. My argument leading up to the election was clear. It was simple. Our country the states were not designed to make dramatic changes like this. And if we did this, it would open them up for exploitation. And we would just never know the full story. I think the research that I have done, that Matt Brainerd has done, I think we can pretty much conclude that the number of irregularities is large enough to exceed the margins in most of these battleground states. I would argue I don't know that about Michigan. I think Biden probably would have won Michigan either way. But as a numbers guy, I can't tell you for sure, whether or not that totally impacted, because I don't know how those people voted, right? We don't know that. It's simply just information we don't have. But everybody on election night didn't seem, or at least some people in the president's campaign didn't seem to understand that there was still going to be that chunk of mail-in vote. And it was a pattern that was really showing up everywhere. In the states where we knew and we had accountability, then the president's election day margin was holding. In states we didn't know, and it was the Wild West, it wasn't holding. And that was, to me, as somebody who's been watching elections for decades, that was concerning, very concerning. It was a first.
What do you think about the audits that are taking place right now? Can you just update us in terms of what you think might occur in, Arizona, Georgia, New Hampshire? Do you think there is, such a margin of error that these election results, could prove that the President Trump that has won in those states?
With a little over 2 million votes in Maricopa County, which was a county that didn't even have some of the major problems that we were identifying in Arizona. So Pima and Apache, even Cochise had a lot of issues, which is, not a blue county, right? Maricopa was actually one that we thought was run a little bit better than some of the others. It isn't hard with that number of votes and that small of a margin. It doesn't take a big error to overtake that margin. Here's the problem I have with the audits. In the beginning, I have argued it has always been about that verification, signature verification, which is already very tenuous. It really is tenuous at best, whether it's credible. But the difference this election compared to prior elections was that we applied a strict standard on whether a voter's signature matched. Michigan is a good example because they put it on paper, but they were doing it everywhere, which is that maybe a signature doesn't match. We'll give the voter the benefit of the doubt, count the vote and move on. By the way, get rid of the envelope so we can't, compare them and track them later. That I've never heard of in my life. I mean, that's not how you compare or validate a signature. These audits aren't going to be checking signatures like that. And in many cases, Pennsylvania, a lot of this evidence is gone. The ability to do that is now gone. I would say there's a lot coming out in Arizona that I think is really concerning. You have Maricopa throw their hands up and decide they don't want to comply anymore. It was a little bit more than ironic. They did that after there was so many problems with between the slips and the number of ballots matching on each ballot. And I would just say, these audits will pick up something irregular if there are major, numbering issues, right? But it will not pick up these signature verification issues. And that's unfortunate because that's going to forever leave a giant question mark on many of these states.
In terms of the difference, and you spoke about this in your latest episode of Inside the Numbers, can you tell us the difference between voter fraud and election fraud and what that entails? Because I think there might be some confusion there with those terms.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And by the way, if these counties, if everybody in the media and all these officials in Maricopa County and Fulton County, if they were so confident in the outcome of this election, the most secure election in the history of our country, then why have they assembled the teams of dozens and dozens of lawyers spending millions upon millions of dollars to stop these efforts, right? You would want your president to be credible and legitimate. So you would just say, for the good of the country, let's let this go forward. But that's not what they're doing because there's no other reason why they would not want this to move forward. It's in the best interest of the country. But this is what I was worried about. And the difference between voter and election fraud is important because this is what I was worried about. With all of these mail-in ballots going out without being requested. Voter fraud is really when a voter, he or she, decides to take it upon herself to commit an act of fraud. Maybe you got an absentee ballot in the mail that you did not request. It's somebody who lived at your address 20 years ago, but because our voter rolls, or earlier, but they no longer live there, but because our voter rolls are so dirty, I call them dirty rolls, right? Because they're not clean and they're not maintained properly. If you don't request one, then that's something that's really beneficial about needing to request it. It's almost a safeguard built into the system. But if it doesn't require it to be requested, all of these change of address flags and all of these ineligible ballots are going to go out. Voter fraud is when a ballot arrives. I'm giving an example, arrives at somebody's house. Maybe they got 2 or 3 and they say, well, who's really going to check? I'm going to fill this out and send it back. Election fraud is a little bit more complicated and it's requires the system's embrace. Before the election, we saw that sting in Philadelphia that was dating back to 2014. It involved election judges in Pennsylvania. So that is election fraud, where it's a much broader effort, maybe a party, election officials themselves are involved. Voter fraud is when a voter tries to vote and they're not eligible. Maybe they fill in an absentee ballot that doesn't belong to them, or they go vote for their friend or whatever it may be, and nobody checks their ID. That's voter fraud. I think what we were dealing with this time is a bit of both. And I say it was outsourcing. Some of these records that we checked were change of address flags, people that no longer lived at a certain address. Somebody filled in their ballot and sent it back, and they're telling us they never requested it, they never filled it in, and they sure did not mail it back. Somebody did that. Now, the difference between voter fraud and election fraud is, how could this have gotten through the system like this? When we looked in Michigan, it was the same clerks over and over and over again. How could they not have caught this? And that's where, my flag goes up. My alarm starts ringing, and it just doesn't make sense. It required some culpability. It really did. I don't know how you would get it through without it.
And you raised these alarms and the red flags very, early on in the process. And actually, as you mentioned, it became political. All these tech sites were suppressing you. Twitter, I think, banned you at one point. You weren't able to log in. What was the information that you posted on Twitter that they were so concerned that they didn't want you to get out there?
Yeah. So when I started, it was basically investigating whether or not some of these claims we were seeing on social media were true. So this many dead people voted in Pennsylvania. This many dead people voted in Michigan. This person did this. And I'm thinking to myself, as at Big Data Poll, we have the resources. I can simply look this up and find out. And I can find out whether these are, legitimate records or not. And I expected I have to say this. I didn't expect a lot of this to be true. I didn't expect to find anything. There's always voter fraud. There's always election fraud.
Right.
Every election, it happens, folks. I hate to tell everybody, burst some naive bubble out there, but it's true. The question was always a matter of whether or not it was enough to affect the outcome. And when we started to dig into this, we did start to find a lot of these records, as I was just mentioning to you. And we would call these people. We would try to call as many as we could. These are actual records, which you match the name, the first name, the last name, middle initial, street address. The media excuses that maybe it's a duplicate name or somebody, it's John Smith that lives over here instead of there. That kind of stuff is not possible. Those excuses don't hold up. We're talking about 5-point matches. And birthday, by the way, is one of them. So you have the same name, the same birthday, and the same address. Come on. All right. So when we found that, I started to say on Twitter, you know what? There may be at least some credibility to some of this. We are starting to find a lot of records that really have to be, somebody has to explain this. And the day that I got removed from Twitter, PolitiFact called. And they wanted it. They wanted the data. And I said, you'll see it when I'm done. I gave them small samples because I wanted to see if they were in good faith, but I would not give them the entire list. They were taking that information and running, not to media outlets, other media outlets. I was a little bit naive, and I was hoping some of these journalists would help me track down some of this, but that's not what their intention was. Their intention was to run to officials. It's like asking the criminal to investigate themselves or make an alibi for themselves. And that's what they were doing, and smearing the source of the information. So after I think I gave the one reporter at PolitiFact maybe 200 records to look at, she never got back to me. She asked, after I said, no, you can't have the full data set, I was gone. I went back to go hang out with my kids, take a break from work. And I started getting text messages about, being banned from Twitter. So I said nothing that was untrue.
Sure.
I offered people to come and look. If they were in good faith, they could come and look and help us out with that. The problem is they were not acting in good faith. They were acting in an attempt to smear anyone who brought forward any evidence whatsoever. And I'd still be off Twitter today if it wasn't for Tucker Carlson. I maintain that, and I'll take that to my grave. He had me on, and within 45 minutes, my account was restored. I am willing to bet without millions of his viewers that wouldn't happen.
That's the flip side of it is, one person with that mouthpiece versus, these somewhat, insidious reporters who are clearly not acting in good faith, even though you were. Let's talk about chain of custody and why it's so important that we needed to investigate where the chain of custody was in all of these ballots and even going forward to have faith in the system. How do we, promote transparency?
Yeah, chain of custody is crucial. So are deadlines for getting those ballots to officials. So these are two things I really tried to stress before the election. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, we have never been faced with these questions before. So number one, it's complicated. Number two, people expect people to do the right thing. They don't want to believe that people would do this, in such a grand scale. So unfortunately, I just couldn't get enough people to really listen to what I was saying. But in many states, Democrats were trying to get, using COVID as a pretext, they were trying to get a whole slew of basically goodies that they've been trying to get for years that they could not get at the ballot box. One of them was ballot harvesting, of course. Many states, it's outlawed. In Nevada, it's not legal. Yet they were still able not only to do it, but to have taxpayers pay for some of it. In a state like Georgia, they used drop boxes. These drop boxes were a big deal because that helped them get around ballot harvesting quite a bit. And unfortunately, Georgia still cannot provide chain of custody for hundreds of thousands of ballots that were put into these drop boxes. So we really don't know who handled them, when were they submitted, when were they picked up, and whether or not it's even a legitimate ballot. And it's not just in battleground states. I feel like some of this was outsourced because we really, John Adams said, if all men were angels, we wouldn't need laws, right? And I feel like we really left it like a Wild West situation, and a lot of people took advantage. We investigated one claim from a group of workers at a hospital in Delaware, which is Joe Biden's home state. And it's up to 37 or so now. There was only 7 Trump voters. The rest were Biden voters. We were trying to check whether or not their absentee ballots were received from a drop box. And amazingly, every single person who voted for Trump at the hospital that was in that group who came forward, not a single one of theirs was posted as recorded and submitted, received, and counted. All 30 of Joe Biden's voters did. So it's not just, we tend to focus on the battleground states, but I think it misses the bigger picture. Chain of custody went out the window in many of these states. And just because they're not battleground states, we shouldn't ignore them too. The whole thing just went awry. I don't know how else to explain that other than somebody who shouldn't have been handling those ballots decided they weren't going to count them, or worse, somebody who's trusted to receive and handle those ballots in an official capacity did something wrong, did something unthinkable, which is look at a Trump ballot and toss it in the garbage. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples of these, and the media just doesn't want you to believe them.
Right. Well, recently, actually today, Facebook changed its policy with respect to suppressing articles about the Wuhan virus and the origins of it. And what was once a taboo topic of the lab leak theory is now becoming more and more possible with evidentiary support, which, a year ago this came out, but Facebook suppressed it because it was a quote unquote taboo topic. Election integrity, for some reason, even though we live in a democracy and we want our government officials and our system to be held accountable, is also a taboo topic. It's just insane. But now that Facebook is finally reversing its position, and I think Twitter might have also, do you think that we will also be given the opportunity to reevaluate this last presidential election and given the chance to see that the media might be forced to report what might seem to be the truth, especially in Maricopa, where, the irregularities were so glaring?
Yeah, enough is enough now, right? I guess enough became enough when the irregularities popped up. And I think that's one of the benefits of these audits. Wisconsin, of course, they have one going on. New Hampshire, we'll see what happens there. I think some of those claims, we need to vet them a little bit more. And then Fulton County is trying to fight legally. That just happened. They're trying to fight the audit that's going on there. But I think, there is hope here for those who care about election integrity, because we get calls now constantly. What do people support? We're thinking about doing election reform here. What would voters support? Is it best to do it through the legislature, or should we hold a referendum? So there's a lot of movement on this issue. I would just say there's also a lot of movement by Democrats. So what looks like HR1, proposals that really resemble HR1 are being done too at the states. They just haven't had a lot of success. They actually propose so far a lot more election reform bills than Republicans have, but Republicans have done a better job passing them. So I think there really is hope, for people to come together on this. When we poll this is not a partisan issue at all, and I know that you would never know that from the media.
No.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost, about 76% support voter ID. Signature verification actually overtook that in our last poll for the first time ever. And that is because it's a conversation that the country's been having despite the media's attempts not to have it. So I feel like there's only so much they can do here. People are still, they can try to boot people like me off. There are unfortunately lots of other people who, didn't get a light shined on them by, big names to help them out that are never going to get their Twitter accounts back. That's unfortunate. But I think in the end, these audits, there's going to be information, regardless of how much it affects an actual outcome. There's going to be information that's going to make it very clear that we need to beef up integrity in this country. And I'm not sure with the amount of public support for all of these different proposals, I'm not sure that they can stop that. And it is sad the media tries to do this though, because I'm a Florida guy, was for over a decade. And I remember when Florida didn't want to be the butt of the joke anymore. And they came together in a bipartisan basis and put together some of the smartest, I wouldn't even use the word strict, most sound, election procedures in the country. Right. And those laws were always on the books. We just had repeat offenders that wouldn't follow them. And Governor Ron DeSantis removed one who was one of the worst, if not the worst, repeat offender. And notice how smooth that election went, right? So without a hit,
they're the first, one of the first to report, right?
And one of the first to be called. Actually, it was probably the first battleground state to be called because it was very clear the former president was going to win it. But it can be done on a bipartisan basis. Majorities of Democrats support these proposals. If you lay them out as plain and as unbiased as you could possibly lay them out, you will see support across the board. And that's encouraging. It really is. It's once the media gets their hands on it and they start reporting it as they see it, that's when Democrats just go to their partisan corners. We did a little experiment where we read the different proposals in HR1, and then we called it HR1 and asked them whether or not they supported it. And ironically, they still couldn't get majority support, but they got a lot more Democrats who wanted it because they knew it was their bill.
So let's talk about some of the poll numbers and how, looking at specific people, President Biden, President Trump, DeSantis. What are you seeing? These key political figures out there.
Right. So for issues in general, Republicans have all of the issues right now. The American voters are completely on the side of Republicans on every issue we've polled so far, except for coronavirus. Voters approve of how Joe Biden is handling the coronavirus, and that's beefing his overall approval rating up. We've had him between 48 and 54. We're about to go in the field again at the end of this month. It'll be our late spring, early summer poll to see where he is. I suspect, I don't know, you'll have to, I guess we'll have to wait, but I suspect he'll tick down a little because he was always hovering between 48 and 52. Not great for a new president, not great at all. The vaccine rollout gave him a little bit of a boost, but on all of the other issues, do you approve of him on immigration? He's underwater. He's even underwater on the economy by a couple of points, which is shocking. At the time we did that last poll, everybody was getting their stimulus checks. Yeah. So you would have thought he would be riding high, but he wasn't. From healing the nation or uniting the nation, the voters don't see him doing that. U.S.-China relations, he's underwater. He's got this one issue right now. That's it. And that can't stay forever. Ron DeSantis, moving on to him. Yeah. If this continues, Charlie Crist is going to get destroyed. It could be one of the biggest margins we've seen in Florida in a very long time. I guess it was after he started doing the sanctuary city agenda, and then just he did what he told voters he was going to do. And we started to see his approval rating rise. He's been in the 60s ever since. So I don't know how you defeat a governor with that kind of popularity. And in a state that is supposed to be as close as Florida to be in the 60s, good luck. Charlie Crist couldn't beat Rick Scott, and he was in the low 40s. So I don't know what he's thinking. I don't see it happening. But as far as other prominent politicians, I think Gavin Newsom, he was in a world of hurt there for a while. I think if Republicans don't get their act together with their candidate, and rally behind somebody, he probably will survive that recall unless something changes. But outside of that, I think we'll just keep an eye on Joe Biden. We'll see how he's doing. But he's in the very low end of the spectrum as far as new presidents go. He is not riding as high as some polls have shown.
What about Trump?
Yeah, Trump is by far the number one choice for Republican voters on who they want to run. Unless somebody steps forward, I know there's a lot of buzz about Ron DeSantis. If Trump does not run again, then he's the favorite, at least right now. A year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, long time in politics. So we have a long way to go. But nobody at this moment, Republicans just don't see anybody with the stature that Donald Trump has. And we're not there yet, but soon we will start asking questions. Basically, do you miss Trump yet? Kind of questions. We did it for Obama, and we'll do it for Trump as well. I mean, it's not a partisan question. You have this much time within an administration, so voters tend sometimes to view the prior president in a more favorable light as time moves on. George W. Bush, he left office extremely underwater. Now look at him, right? 52 favorable, something, around that. I bet you Trump is, I bet you he's probably doing a little bit better right now than he had been before. There's just an element that couldn't warm up to him, even though they'd vote for him because he was viewed as competent and just capable. He was a capable leader. So they voted for him. But I'm not going to be shocked if there's an uptick in his favorables.
Richard Baris, this has been truly a fascinating conversation. I have learned so much about polling and all of the what goes into it. I need to learn more, but where can we find you? Where can we learn more and become more informed so that we don't have to go through this again in our next election cycle?
People can still follow me on Twitter. Well, I still have the account.
He's back.
At Peoples_Pundit on Twitter. We have, of course, the show on People's Pundit Daily's YouTube channel, Inside the Numbers, and we also do What Are the Odds with Robert Barnes. But for a lot of good polling information, we started a locals page. It's doing pretty good. peoplespundit.locals.com. What's interesting there is you can actually be involved in building the questionnaires when we build these polls and to get them ready to put into the field, which we're doing soon. So it gives people a lot better understanding of how polls are designed, how the questionnaires are designed, and what goes into it and how they're conducted. The public polling project that we did at Big Data Poll was something we've never seen before. And I'm very, very excited that we can keep this going because it really is all about transparency. Gone are the days of the pollster, doing a poll and then CNN, Biden +2 because it's not good enough anymore. We have to, tell people, and not just to educate them, but tell them why. Why is it Biden +2, right? And what could change that? If what assumptions did we make that could change that? And that's what we're trying to do over there. And basically, I hope to keep doing it because it's the only way we're ever going to get this industry back on track.
And we're thankful for that and for all of the work that you do, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. All the best.
All right. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Have a safe and healthy night.